Hi, and welcome to Radical Priorities. My name is Aidan Clark. In this episode, we're going to be looking at neoliberalism. It's a political, philosophical, and economic doctrine. It's a form of government policy at its most basic. And as a reference point, we're going to be reviewing and critiquing and repurposing an article written by Perry Anderson in the London Review of Books called Regime Change in the West. An article which is itself a review of a recent book called The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order by Gary Gersel. We're going to be looking at a couple of dates and a timeline, starting in 1929 all the way up to 2008 and into our own present period of economic dysfunction and dysphoria. Now, 1929 and 2008 are not arbitrary dates. They're, of course, the two great financial crises in modern capitalism. One was the Great Depression. The other was the Great Recession. We didn't reach the same depressionary conditions, but at the same time, we didn't have a serious political and economic response to our own market crash. And this will prove to be a very, very important difference as we go into breaking down the argument of this article. Because its interest is to ask why. Why did the 1930s get fascism on the one hand and social democracy and American economic liberalism on the other, whereas 2008 got merely an intensification of the underlying economic principles that had resulted in the economic crash of 2008? Now, there should be a fair degree of hysteria and wonderment, if not outright amazement at the fact that we basically have done nothing to change our system. We might reflect on the success and failures of many of those political and economic movements following the crash of 1929, but many of them were great successes and led enormous amounts of economic growth, spurred on huge amounts of demand and production until their eventual slowdown in the 1970s. Probably won't surprise you if I tell you that during that slowdown in the 1970s, neoliberalism proper began. But let's start with 1929. Well, the situation was a stock market crash. Over-speculation resulted in the global economy being overly dependent upon trades, financial trades that turned out to be fairly bogus, mass fraud. And eventually, when the money had to be called in and debts actually paid for, the money wasn't there. The result was system crash, and this created a global depression. Now, there were a variety of economic policies that emerged over and throughout the 1930s. Now, eventually they came to focus on using government monetary policy to create mass employment. And it was those series of economic policies, plus World War II, which forced the world into a total effort of production in order to defeat the Nazis, that resulted more or less in the post-war contract that people encountered upon returning from the front. Now, people will know of the great housing projects, the mass industrialization in the post-war period. This was a continuation of insights that they had gleaned into how certain forms of economic liberalization and monetary policy could actually make use of government to spur mass employment, huge production, and on that basis ground social security, the institutions that we've come to know and love that define our democracy, define our modern health systems, our education systems. All of these systems relied upon the wealth, growth, demand, and production that became utterly essential when the Great Depression hit the world economy, not least the wholesale rejection, effectively across the political spectrum, whether you were a right-wing fascist or a left-wing communist, of financial speculation, of an over-reliance upon instruments like the stock market to motivate not just production, but also to create production, to be the engine room, if you will, of economic productivity. There were a variety of reasons for the eventual demise of this 50-year or 45-year post-1929 system. Perhaps the most defining date was the Nixon shock, the objective decision of the American government to end Bretton Woods, to end, effectively, any constraints on just how valued the American dollar could become. Now, this change was a reaction to the inability of capital to generate profit in the way that it had in the post-war period. Remember that by the 1970s, we've done a lot of the industrial production. We've done a lot of the house building. Institutions are starting to ossify. They expect regularly increasing wages that cannot necessarily be sustained or supported by the actually existing levels of growth and productivity. Now, productivity and growth tend to happen with technological change or great disruptive periods, huge changes in political regime, again, post-war periods. But without these two highly motivating factors of political and technological change, it's very difficult to get growth. And in fact, growth perhaps can become a slightly nefarious goal. Do you keep the economy alive just so you can have the pretense of growth as the driving motivation and ambition of human society? Or when you reach a failure in the generation of growth, do you say, okay, we need a new system? It won't surprise you that the world went one way and not another. We didn't have a big conversation about how, well, maybe wages and productivity, maybe market-driven growth as a whole is not necessarily going to save us. If even 40 years on from the market crash, we find ourselves regularly caught up in the cycle of boom and bust, the cycle of unmanageable difficulty and dysfunction in the economy. Now, in the case of the 1970s, it wasn't even what's called the business cycle, that kind of boom and bust phenomenon. It was an outright breakdown of the standard metrics for evaluating economic growth. It was a breakdown, really, of that 40-year consensus of economic liberalism. It resulted in something called stagflation, where the economy was both shrinking and yet unemployment was also rising. Now, this was a confusion for many of the economic theorists of the time. And the new order, as I said, grounded upon vicious political change, things like the Nixon shock, things like the oil crisis that also forced the hands of many politicians, among a variety of other crises, resulted in a change in economic regime. I quote from the article, where the post-war order had been driven by the aim of assuring full employment, the priority of its sequel was monetary stability. People will be familiar with the fact that we only ever seem to talk about inflation and interest rates nowadays. Now, this is a hallmark of economic neoliberalism. Why? Well, because when you want to get stability, and specifically monetary stability, the two things that might affect that are going to be the cost of money, i.e. interest rates, and inflation, the thing that turns money into something worthless. When, however, you want to generate growth in what is becoming an exclusively monetary system, your emphasis is no longer on growth or productivity in the typical sense. Political and technological innovation is no longer the hallmark of human society or of human motivation. The interest becomes a series of tools and doctrines, which we're going to call, and have been called, neoliberalism. And I quote again from the article, the hallmarks of the system are, quote, deregulation of financial and product markets, privatization of services and industries, reduction of corporate and wealth taxation, attrition or emasculation of trade unions. Now, all of this was done to, quote, restore the rates of profit to capital, which had fallen virtually everywhere from the late 1960s onwards. This was that slowdown I've already mentioned, and it was responded to with this series of instruments, from deregulation to privatization to attrition. In other words, policymakers, economists, government political actors had to make a decision about whether or not they were going to somehow come up with some miracle of post-war growth to support wages, to support not even industrialization, but industrial jobs, and to support the institutions that had coordinated the virtues and values of Western life, or they were going to have to pull the plug on that system entirely, cut the funding of those institutions, deregulate the existing places of profit upon which we could meaningfully rely. Now, the result of that reliance would be a radical privatization. Financialized power is not the same as providing jobs to people who work in your steel factories or in your auto factories or building those homes in a post-war growth spur. It means providing enormous political support to the financial industry, which was really the last great capitalist industry. So how did this new neoliberal program work? Well, I quote, "For a quarter of a century, the remedies of neoliberalism appeared to work. Growth returned, if at a markedly lower pace than in the quarter of a century after the Second World War. Inflation was mastered. Recessions were short and shallow. Rates of profit rebounded. Economists and pundits hailed the triumph of what the future chairman of the Federal Reserve in the United States, Ben Bernanke, extolled as the Great Moderation. The success of neoliberalism as an international system didn't rest, however, on the recovery of investment to the levels of the post-war era in the West. This would have required an increase in economic demand, precluded by the wage repression central to the system. It was built rather on a massive expansion of credit. That is, on the creation of unprecedented levels of private, corporate, and eventually public debt." So what do you notice from all of this? Our modern post-2008 years are sensitive to a strange contradiction in this argument. Well, aren't neoliberals, aren't people who prioritize financial investment on the side of reducing government, reducing debt? Why are they being portrayed as the ultimate supporters of massive credit expansion? Well, this gets back to the earlier point that monetary stability had to be achieved at all costs. Well, unfortunately, why was that monetary stability so volatile, so fragile and vulnerable? Because so much money had to be created out of thin air in order to effectively synthesize the growth that was no longer there politically, technologically, industrially. Again, instead of building houses, building cars, building dams, and basing a thriving civil society with strong wages on the production of those things, financial markets allowed us to say, well, we know people are going to make cars, we know people are going to make houses, who cares if they actually do it? All we have to do is to continue to lubricate those transactions, continue to get people to buy cars, pay to make cars, etc. But the most important part of that system becomes the financial transaction itself, even when eventually, as in 2008, people are taking more mortgages than they can ever possibly pay down. There's fraud in the system in terms of providing approvals for mortgages, and as it turns out, there's more value in speculating on the housing market than there is in the housing market itself. That's what results in the crashing house of cards of 2008. But it relies upon an unholy alliance of massive liberalization of the private financial industry, supported, however, not just by the deregulation of governments, but by enormous expansions of credit, which means enormous expansions of the monetary and debt systems. These are collective systems. It's central banks in the hands of the people that choose to print this money to make this level of debt possible. Most people will say, oh, but it's fine, because we're going to eventually achieve the levels of growth upon which we speculate. It's just an anticipation of what's already going to happen. But again, if the financial system is betting on a housing market that doesn't exist, an auto-making industry that doesn't exist, on wages that don't exist, on labor markets that don't exist, what is all of this capital and all of this investment actually investing in? Well, the emergence of that political position which says, oh, we have to lower taxes, we have to continue this process of deregulation, but let's also not talk about the enormous amounts of credit that we're also bankrolling in order to maintain massive amounts of consumerism, to maintain the fiction of a living, productive social society. Well, the other thing that also became important was something called austerity. And I quote, "In Britain, which came first in the process, the ruthless imposition of austerity cut local authority spending to mendicant levels and slashed university pensions. In Spain and Italy, labor legislation was revised to facilitate the summary firing of workers and increase precarious employment. In the United States, drastic reductions in taxes on corporations and the rich were retained, while deregulation accelerated in energy and financial services." This is the post-2008 world. This is not just cutting down, as was done in the 1970s and 1980s, to make room for greater financialization. This is not simply saying, okay, maybe we don't need as many institutions, as much homegrown industrialization. We can start to export it abroad. This is effectively taking the last morsels of that remaining post-war wealth, post-war institutional productivity, and cutting into it, selling it piece by piece, cutting it job by job, in order to feed the hungry engine of continued financial speculation. Remember what I said in distinguishing the differences in political, social, and economic response to 1929 versus 2008. Well, this is it. 1929 saw again a host of radical, some very scary political and economic movements, but it also saw the basis of a post-war institutional monetary policy. Now, maybe that monetary policy was doomed to fail, and we've already identified the problem with trying to maintain post-war growth levels when you don't need to continue buying houses or creating massive superhighways. But we can also see in what respect our response to 2008 was impoverished at best. We didn't change anything. In fact, we ignored how we didn't have another system waiting in the wings, political philosophies. And in fact, worse than that, what we had was really a series of political instruments that had continued to make it absolutely impossible to gain back a variety of things: democratic control, economic regulation on the basis of a sustainable growth, and control even over things as basic as our borders. I'll get back to the question of borders because it represents a rather interesting distinction as far as the response politically we did get, and the political response we did get was, of course, populism. We got eventually a populist response. Trump, Brexit. We also got it on the left, to an extent, Bernie Sanders. But the biggest problem was that none of these things put forward an actual logistical or pragmatic plan. They didn't have a political philosophy, and they didn't have an alternative economic system. This would prove fatal. The seeds for populism are caught up in this lack of a response to 2008. And maybe that also explains the particularly repressed nature of the populist response on either the left or the right. Now, if you compare them with the technocracy of post-2008 monetary policy, continuing the massive credit expansion, they're a lot more ethically and politically engaged. But, I quote, after 2008, its accumulated social and political consequences started to come home to roost. Social consequences: a steep and in some cases staggering escalation of inequality, long-term wage stagnation, a spreading precariat. Political consequences: wholesale corruption, growing interchangeability of parties, erosion of meaningful electoral choice, declining voter participation. In short, the increasing eclipse of the popular will by a hardening oligarchy. As a side note, I have to applaud this article in the London Review of Books. I have rarely seen an article that pulls no punches in its description of the post-2008 malaise. But again, we see many of the hallmarks of our present sense of dysfunction. Political parties that look the same. Wage stagnation that goes back to the 1970s. We didn't fix wage stagnation. On the contrary, we actually compounded wage depression by refusing to actually figure out how to keep growing, how to figure out demand, how to reindustrialize. On top of that, you have the breakdown of democracy. This is not just the failure of political parties to provide meaningful distinctions in policy. It's the fact that behind neoliberalism is three principles, and I quote from the present article. We have an escalation of differentials in wealth and income. We have an abrogation of democratic control and representation, and we have a deregulation of as many economic transactions as is feasible. In short, inequality, oligarchy, and factor mobility. What that means is that the present program was intentional. There was at first a deliberate need to get growth from somewhere, but then it became a wholesale replacement of anything like industrial capitalism, anything like a technologically motivated capitalism, into not just a merely financialized system, but a financialized system that had taken hold of democracy, had taken hold of any possibility of discussing or rectifying massive income inequality, but also, and this is the most interesting point, a system that was no longer able to deal with what's called factor mobility. Now, factor mobility is things like the ability for labor to go anywhere. That means cheap Chinese labor, cheap Mexican labor. We've heard this before on the right and on the left to an extent, but the article is rather perspicacious in identifying that most of the left can deal with the first two principles, inequality and lack of democracy, but it struggles on the third. It compromises its morality, its moral stance, the moment it starts to talk about immigration. But the article is also critical in the fact that the left has never come up with a competent system of immigration. And if anything, the system of immigration that we have is globalization. It's a view of the human being, a view of unfettered economic transaction, which believes that to hell with culture, to hell with society, on either side of the pond. This is not just about protecting Western society. It's also about those countries that have found themselves utterly destroyed by the same movement of financial capital, the wars waged in defense of financial capital that have resulted in the destruction of common ways of life in non-Western countries. In a sense, both the West and the non-West have been mutually implicated in this. There's a crisis of democracy no matter where you look. And at the end of all of this is a massive explosion of debt, more debt. When you look at the political spectrum today, again, you see on the one hand right-wing parties that want a destruction of debt, even as it seems as if the right is the most interested in radical financialization. But this is part of the strange ideological fog. It's as if conservatives don't understand that they themselves only get radical market growth of the neoliberal variety if they can continue to produce governments that are willing to create enormous amounts of debt for the sake of this system, for the sake of monetary stability. That, of course, has become radical monetary instability. Every possible stability, from growth to wages to institutional stability to democratic stability, has been sacrificed for the sake of financial markets. It's strange that the conservatives believe, but there's no other form of growth that we can have. This distinguishes traditional conservatives from people like Trump or Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom, who have said, let's go back to industrial growth. And some of them still want stock markets and American capital supremacy, mainly financially denominated, and they won't get it any more than they're going to get industrial growth back. There's a reason why it's slowed down. We don't have a war. We don't have a need for housing that we can sustain with thoughtful economic contracts. Now, maybe we can get those economic contracts back, and maybe the tech revolution, maybe AI, is going to help us do this. But unfortunately, there's a reason why they could build houses at the rate that they did in the post-war period. It's because they had already had 20 years of economic liberalism to support the basic economics for sustaining genuine growth, genuine wages. And this is not necessarily to even address whether that is possible, whether we're going to continue to have to invent endless forms of growth just to maintain the basic stability of our wage systems, of people getting paid, of people having work. It might just be that this is where we have to talk about capitalism. It's not enough when growth is artificial, growth is decoupled from the environment, but also from human society. This is a far greater catastrophe than even Trump or Nigel Farage are willing to address, as much as they might be interested in certain forms of economic nationalization, on supporting workers' rights, on bringing back industry and stabilizing a genuine wage growth system. And in fact, in order to get to the core of just how difficult the situation is, I'll give you a final quote. In some ways, a yet harsher indictment of the socioeconomic balance sheet since Reagan comes from a former admirer of the Gipper, the Indian-American banker Ruchir Sharma, formerly chief global strategist at Morgan Stanley, in What Went Wrong with Capitalism. Its leitmotif is that the periodic financial crises erupting in 2001, 2008, and 2020 now unfold against the background of a permanent daily crisis of colossal capital misallocation, the result of enormous infusions of easy money injected into the advanced economies by central banks to prop up steadily declining rates of growth. Such state-dispensed torrents of cash are the ultimate, overriding truth of the period. Sooner or later, Sharma warns, a momentous shock to the system is bound to come. What remedy would that bring? Sharma's answer? Return to a smaller state and tighter money, the classic recipe of Mises and Hayek. Neoliberalism rendered whole once more. I've already mentioned the confusion in the conservatives. They want, to some extent, this period of easy money to end. What they totally underestimate, in this sense, what the technocrats of Davos have over them, is that you cannot just end this kind of monetary policy. It's not just supporting financial growth, it's synthesizing it. It is artificially creating it. That financial growth is not real financial growth. Real financial growth would be one coupled to an actually existing housing market, an actually existing auto market. In this sense, you're not going to get back any kind of growth, either financial or industrial, unless you have a wholesale plan to re-industrialize, even if government is smaller, even if money is a lot harder to get and there are greater controls on both the financial industry and on credit. That's not necessarily going to get you your growth back. And this is the problem. We have a decision in front of us. Are we going to deal with growth as a concept, as a perhaps concept of escape that is keeping us more in prison than we would like to admit? Many people do not necessarily have the courage to face this, that even post-war growth is not possible, that period still relied upon markets, still relied upon capitalism, still relies upon a way of thinking about value as entirely market denominated. The 1929 crash, after all, came from somewhere. Those levels of financial speculation were not accidental. In that sense, the contrast in this article between valuable political and economic responses versus valueless political and economic responses hardly captures the fact that 1929 did not happen in a vacuum. The fact that we've seen two additional factors. One, 2020 pandemic, which resulted not just in an intensification of monetary policy, but in a full throttle decouplement of financial markets from the real economy. There is no longer any connection between the possibility even of normal industrial growth and financial markets. In this sense, we're in a worse situation even than 2008, where at least we maintained the pretense of a housing market. We also have had the tech revolution, which now is pumping artificial intelligence wherever it can. Artificial intelligence is not our friend. It's not going to save us. Artificial intelligence is a concept of growth without humans. So what's the point of the growth? What's the social context of the growth? Why do we need the growth? At the end of the day, growth is used as a metaphor to keep human beings motivated, to make an argument that as long as we keep contributing to an economy productively, that economy will reward us with stability. It will reward us with increased productivity. It will reward us with wage growth and stability. It will reward us, yes, perhaps with stable democratic institutions, stable monetary institutions, stable financial institutions. The catastrophe is in growth. The catastrophe is in the economic system as a whole. We can call it capitalism, you can call it whatever you want. Relying upon an economy, upon a market society for all decision making, for all concepts of human motivation, is where the rot begins. In this sense, I will reaffirm the premise of this, the argument of this article. We need to come up with a response. The truth is, we do not have an alternative to capitalism. We cannot just tax ourselves back to post-war growth. We cannot just tax the rich in order to get back post-war productivity. It's never going to happen. This is not a monetary problem. In that sense, both the left and the right are wrong. That's the catastrophe. That's the void we're staring at. We do not have an alternative. And if people really want to think what the next step is, they need to sit down and figure out practically what a possible alternative means. They need to stare the problem in the face. What would a world without an economy look like? It might seem radical right now, but it's absolutely essential. And the scary thing is that the system will change unless we ask it to. Politics will not change unless we ask them to. We have had repeated economic crisis without change. All we have ever innovated is the capacity to sell more of the system, more of human beings, in order to maintain the engines of a system that does not care about us, in order to maintain productivity even when that productivity is decoupled from reality. Economists have been the first vanguards in producing the theory to maintain this full-scale robbery of the human being, of systems, of culture, of society. But they've used a very clever series of metaphors in order to convince us that it's our fault, that we haven't been productive enough, that we haven't engaged in sufficient schemes of detaxation, of deregulation to allow the captains of industry to do the work that they need to do. We must fully reject this. What most argue is that we can only be free if we're conservative. We can only be free if we believe in deregulation. That is not freedom. Freedom that remains radically individualistic, that remains interested in profit even when that profit is coming at the expense of the system. The massive inflationary cost of living crises in food, in housing, all across the economy are caused by one thing: the increasing cost of maintaining this system, the cost of the debt to maintaining this system. We have to continue to give people money to work with. That is at the core of neoliberalization. That is at the core of post-2008 neoliberalization. In many ways, we're beyond neoliberalism. We're in a system of total atrophy on the one side, followed by pure market performance on the other, to the tune of trillions of dollars. This is the political struggle of today. Are we going to figure out what to do next or not? Do we really believe in freedom, in radical political intervention or not? Either we believe in it and are willing to demonstrate it in our acts by changing everything, by rejecting the conservatism, by rejecting the dogma, by rejecting the gaslighting, or we have to admit to ourselves that we don't believe in that freedom. And we should call out at the very least those people who pretend to be freedom fighters for and yet only believe in freedom to the extent that it is identifiable with economic liberalization, with economies as a whole. Please join us. Radical Priorities is a political movement. We want to have more of these conversations. More importantly, we want to figure out the logistics and the practical next steps for figuring out what this movement can look like, what genuine political freedom can look like, what a post-economic world can look like. Listen in to our podcast or to our YouTube videos. Thank you for listening.